March 17th, 1940. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. The Victorian mansion stood 50 miles northwest of London, surrounded by temporary wooden huts that housed Britain's most secret weapon in the war against Nazi Germany. Inside Hut 8, the Naval Enigma section, 23 cryptanalysts worked in shifts around the clock attempting to break German naval communications. The room smelled of stale tobacco smoke, burnt coffee, and the particular odor of exhausted human beings who had been staring at encrypted messages for too many consecutive hours. Mathematical equations covered every blackboard, intercepted German naval signals covered every desk, and in the corner, at a small wooden table that wobbled whenever she wrote, sat Joan Clarke. Clarke was 23 years old. She had graduated from Cambridge University with a double first in mathematics, a distinction achieved by fewer than 5 students per year across all subjects. Her thesis on number theory had impressed her professors enough that they recommended her for cryptanalytic work when the war began. She had arrived at Bletchley Park in June 1939, 3 months before Britain declared war on Germany, part of the initial recruitment wave that brought mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions to this unlikely location where Britain would wage its secret war against German codes. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. The work in Hut 8 focused on breaking Enigma, the German encryption machine that protected naval communications. Enigma was a mechanical cipher device roughly the size of a typewriter, with a keyboard, a lamp board displaying encrypted letters, and a series of rotating wheels called rotors that scrambled messages according to mathematical transformations so complex that German cryptographers believed the code was unbreakable. They were almost right. The machine itself was an elegant piece of engineering. When an operator pressed a key, electrical current flowed through a plug board that performed initial letter substitution, then through 3 rotors in sequence, each performing its own complex substitution based on internal wiring and current position. The current then hit a reflector that sent it back through the rotors in reverse, following a different path, before finally illuminating a lamp on the lamp board showing the encrypted letter. After each key press, the rightmost rotor advanced 1 position, changing the encryption pathway for the next letter. The mathematical complexity of Enigma was staggering. Each rotor had 26 positions, 1 for each letter of the alphabet. The machine used 3 rotors selected from a set of 5, with each rotor capable of being set to any starting position. That alone created 60 times 26 times 26 times 26 combinations, or over 1 million starting positions. But the plugboard added exponentially more complexity by swapping up to 10 pairs of letters before and after the rotor encryption. The total number of possible Enigma settings exceeded 150 million possible combinations. Finding the correct setting for any given day through brute force would require testing every combination, a task that would take longer than the age of the universe using 1940s technology. The German Navy used an even more complex variant called Kriegsmarine Enigma. It employed additional rotors, more plugboard connections, and special procedures for authenticating messages. German naval operators changed settings daily, using codebooks that specified which rotors to use, what positions to set them to, and which plugboard connections to make. Even if British cryptanalysts broke today's settings, tomorrow's settings would be completely different. The problem had to be solved fresh every single day, and every day that British codebreakers failed to solve it, U-boats sank merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and weapons to Britain. But Clarke had noticed something. a pattern in the encrypted messages that suggested a weakness in how German naval operators used the Enigma machine. It wasn't a flaw in the mathematics. It was a flaw in human procedure. And if she was right, it could provide the breakthrough that Hut 8 desperately needed. She had been working night shifts, the quiet hours between midnight and 8 in the morning when most of the day staff had gone home, and the hut fell into the particular silence of deep concentration. During these shifts, she would spread intercepted messages across her desk and study them not for their content, but for their structure. She noticed that messages always began with the same format, a 3-letter indicator group that told the receiving station which rotor positions to use for decrypting the message. This indicator was itself encrypted, but German procedure required it to be encrypted twice using the same key settings. The rationale behind this procedure made sense from a German perspective. Send the indicator twice to ensure transmission errors didn't make the message undecryptable. If the receiving operator misread one version, they could check against the other. Simple error correction. But Clark realized that this redundancy created a mathematical vulnerability that German cryptographers had apparently never considered. She began recording every indicator group from every intercepted message. Within a week, she had cataloged over 400 indicator pairs. She created frequency tables showing which letter pairs appeared most often in the first encrypted indicator versus the second encrypted indicator. Random encryption should produce uniform distribution across all letter combinations. But Clark's tables showed clear statistical clustering. Certain letter combinations appeared significantly more often than others. This meant one of two things. Either the Enigma machine had a mathematical flaw in its randomization, which seemed unlikely given its mechanical design, or German operators were not choosing truly random 3-letter indicators. They were exhibiting the unconscious biases that all humans exhibit when asked to generate randomness. They chose letters near each other on the keyboard. They avoided awkward letter sequences like QXZ. They reused patterns they'd used before. They picked indicators that were easy to remember or easy to type. Clark tested her hypothesis by analyzing the keyboard layout of German typewriters, which was different from English keyboards. She predicted that operators would favor letter combinations that appeared close together on their keyboard. When she mapped the frequency distribution of indicators onto a German keyboard layout, the clustering became even more obvious. The most common indicators used letters that were adjacent or diagonal to each other on German keyboards. More importantly, Clark realized that the double encryption of indicators created a mathematical relationship that could be exploited. Each encrypted indicator was related to the other by a specific mathematical transformation determined by the rotor settings. If you collected enough indicator pairs, you could use statistical analysis to identify which rotor positions were most likely to produce the observed distribution of encrypted pairs. This wouldn't tell you the exact settings immediately, but it would dramatically narrow the search space from hundreds of millions of combinations down to thousands. She spent the next 2 weeks developing the complete mathematical framework. She filled 6 notebooks with calculations, working through probability theory, frequency analysis, and information theory. She created statistical tables showing the expected distribution of indicator pairs for different rotor positions. She developed algorithms for analyzing intercepts and calculating which rotor settings were most probable. When she tested her method on historical intercepts where the settings were already known, it successfully identified the correct rotor positions with 73% accuracy. The method required substantial manual calculation. Clerks would need to maintain indicator frequency tables, update them as new intercepts arrived, calculate statistical distributions, and generate lists of probable rotor settings. But Clark estimated that this process would take 20-30 person-hours per day to maintain, compared to the hundreds of person-hours currently spent on unsuccessful brute force attempts. and her method would provide guidance applicable to all intercepts simultaneously, not just individual messages tackled in isolation. The meeting took place on a cold March afternoon in Deniston's office, a cramped room that served as both workspace and storage for sensitive documents. Deniston sat behind a desk piled with intercepted messages, decryption attempts, and administrative paperwork. He was a veteran cryptanalyst who had broken German codes during the First World War, a man who understood both the mathematics and the bureaucratic realities of intelligence work. When Clark entered, he gestured to a chair and lit his pipe, the smoke adding another layer to the office's already substantial tobacco haze. Clark explained her approach methodically. She showed him the statistical patterns in the indicators. She demonstrated how the double encryption created exploitable mathematical relationships. She walked through her calculations, showing that her method could reduce the search space by a factor of approximately 10,000. She presented it as clearly as she could, using language that balanced mathematical precision with practical explanation. When she finished, Deniston puffed his pipe thoughtfully and studied her calculations. Then he called in 3 senior cryptanalysts to review her work. The 3 men crowded into the small office, looking at Clark's notebooks with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. They were all experienced code breakers who had spent months attacking Enigma without significant success. Now, a young woman fresh from university was proposing a method they hadn't considered. The oldest of the 3, a Cambridge mathematics professor named Hugh Alexander, spoke first. His tone was polite but dismissive. "Miss Clark, your statistical analysis is interesting, but I'm not convinced it's practical. The patterns you've identified are real, but they're subtle. The signal-to-noise ratio is poor, and even if your method works in theory, implementing it would require massive manual calculation effort. We would need dozens of people working full-time just to process the indicator tables. That's personnel we don't have." Clark kept her voice steady and professional. "Mr. Alexander, I've calculated the personnel requirements. We would need approximately 30 clerks working in shifts to maintain the indicator tables and perform the statistical analysis. That's fewer people than we currently employ attempting full brute force attacks on individual messages. And my method would work on all messages simultaneously, not just isolated intercepts. The efficiency gain is substantial." Another cryptanalyst, a young man named Peter Twin, who had been working at Bletchley Park since its inception, shook his head skeptically. "Miss Clark, the fundamental problem is that you're assuming German operators are biased in their choice of indicators, but we train our own operators to avoid exactly these kinds of biases. Why would we assume German operators are less professional than ours?" Clark had anticipated this objection. "Because humans are universally bad at generating randomness, regardless of training. Studies of random number generation consistently show that people exhibit predictable biases. We avoid certain number combinations. We favor symmetrical patterns. We repeat ourselves more than true randomness would predict. These aren't failures of training. They're cognitive limitations inherent to how human minds process information. German operators are subject to the same limitations as British operators." The third cryptanalyst, Gordon Welchman, leaned forward with interest. Unlike the others, he seemed genuinely intrigued rather than skeptical. "Miss Clark, have you tested your method on actual intercepts? Not just theoretical calculations, but real application to real messages?" Clark pulled out another notebook. "I've applied the method to 73 intercepted messages from the past 2 weeks. The indicator analysis successfully narrowed the rotor settings to approximately 4,200 possible combinations for each day. We then tested those combinations manually and found the correct daily setting within 6 hours of focused work. That's dramatically faster than our current approach, which typically takes days and often fails entirely." Welchman studied her test results carefully. "These results are impressive. Why haven't you presented them earlier?" Clark hesitated. This was the sensitive part. I wanted to be certain the method worked before bringing it to attention. But also, I wasn't sure my input would be valued. I'm aware that mathematics is considered men's work. I'm aware that my position here is somewhat unusual. I didn't want to waste senior staff time with ideas that might be dismissed as amateur theorizing. The room fell silent. The four men exchanged glances that communicated something Clark couldn't quite interpret. Finally, Commander Denniston spoke, his tone carefully neutral. Miss Clark, your position here is based on your mathematical ability, not your gender. If you have methods that advance our work, you're expected to present them. That said, he paused, choosing his words carefully. There are officers in the military establishment who hold traditional views about women's capabilities in technical fields. Some of those officers control resources we need. Your method may be mathematically sound, but implementing it will require approval from people who may not share our enlightened view that mathematical ability transcends gender. Alexander added, with a hint of apology in his voice. What the commander means, Miss Clark, is that we believe your method has merit. But we're going to face resistance from senior naval officers who will question whether a woman can truly understand the complexities of naval cryptography. It's not fair, it's not rational, but it's the political reality we operate within. Clark felt anger rising but suppressed it. Anger wouldn't help. Logic might. Gentlemen, I understand the politics, but we're losing merchant ships every day because we can't read German naval communications. U-boats are sinking vessels faster than we can replace them. Every day we delay implementing better cryptanalytic methods is a day that costs lives. Surely that matters more than institutional biases about who can contribute to the solution. Denniston nodded slowly. It should matter more. Whether it will matter more remains to be seen. But I'll take your method to the Naval Intelligence Division. I'll advocate for its implementation. Be prepared for skepticism, and be prepared to defend your work against challenges that have nothing to do with its mathematical validity. Over the next 2 weeks, Clark's method underwent review by naval intelligence officers who approached it with varying degrees of skepticism. The review process became an exercise in navigating institutional politics as much as defending mathematical validity. Some officers examined the mathematics seriously and acknowledged its merit. Commander Edward Travis, Deputy Director of Bletchley Park, spent 3 hours going through Clark's calculations, line by line, asking pointed questions about statistical confidence intervals and implementation requirements. He concluded that the method was sound and recommended immediate implementation. But others dismissed it immediately based on Clark's age, inexperience, or gender. Captain Ralph Erskine, a senior naval intelligence liaison, refused to even review the technical details. His objection was purely institutional. I will not stake naval operations on calculations performed by a woman barely out of university. She may be clever at Cambridge mathematics, but this is war. We need proven methods, not theoretical exercises from someone who has never seen combat. One particularly hostile meeting took place in late March, when Clark was asked to present her method to a review committee of 4 naval captains. She entered the conference room carrying her notebooks, her frequency tables, and her test results. The captains sat along one side of a mahogany table, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions ranging from polite skepticism to open hostility. Clark began her presentation. She explained the indicator procedure. She showed the frequency distributions. She demonstrated the keyboard clustering. She walked through the mathematical relationships. 10 minutes into her presentation, one captain interrupted. Miss Clark, I appreciate that you find these statistical patterns interesting, but frankly, I question whether a young woman can truly grasp the complexities of naval cryptography. This isn't abstract university mathematics. This is operational intelligence that determines whether sailors live or die. Clark felt heat rising in her face, but kept her voice level. "Captain, the mathematics doesn't care about my gender. The frequency distributions I've identified exist independently of who discovered them. The question isn't whether I'm qualified to do this work. The evidence shows I've already done it. The question is whether you're willing to accept results that happen to come from someone you didn't expect." Another captain interjected with a different objection. "Even assuming your analysis is correct, implementing it would require allocating scarce personnel to maintain these indicator tables and perform statistical calculations. We have limited resources. Why should we divert them to an unproven method when we could use those same resources to expand our existing approaches?" Clark had prepared for this objection. "Because our existing approaches aren't working. We're breaking perhaps 10% of naval Enigma messages, usually days or weeks after interception, when the intelligence value has degraded to near zero. My method, tested on 2 weeks of historical intercepts, successfully narrows rotor settings in 73% of cases. That's a 7-fold improvement in success rate. The personnel cost is approximately 30 clerks working in shifts. We currently employ over 50 people attempting brute force attacks that mostly fail. This is more efficient, not less." The hostile captain wasn't finished. "Miss Clark, let me be direct. I commanded destroyers in the Mediterranean. I've fought U-boats. I've lost ships and men to enemy action. And now you're telling me that critical naval intelligence should depend on statistical theories developed by someone who has never been to sea, never faced combat, never carried responsibility for lives depending on your decisions. Why should I trust you?" The room fell silent. Clark understood this wasn't really a question about cryptanalysis. It was a test. Would she back down when confronted with the authority of combat experience and gender hierarchy? Or would she defend her work despite lacking the credentials that this man valued? She chose her words carefully. "Captain, you're absolutely correct that I've never commanded ships or faced combat, but you've never developed cryptanalytic methods or performed statistical analysis of encrypted communications. We each have expertise the other lacks. The difference is that I'm not asking you to trust my seamanship. I'm asking you to evaluate mathematical methods within their proper domain. And in that domain, my lack of combat experience is irrelevant. The methods work or they don't. The test results show they work. Your choice is whether to use a method that works but comes from an unexpected source, or to reject it based on who I am rather than what I've proven." The tension in the room was palpable. The captains exchanged glances. Finally, the senior captain spoke. "Miss Clark, we will take your presentation under advisement. You'll be informed of our decision." Clark gathered her materials and left, understanding that under advisement often meant politely rejected. She returned to Hut 8, expecting that her method would be shelved despite its demonstrated effectiveness. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Admiral John Godfrey, Director of Naval Intelligence, reviewed Clark's method personally. Godfrey was a pragmatist who cared more about results than credentials. He had spent his career fighting bureaucratic inertia within the Royal Navy, and had little patience for officers who let tradition interfere with effectiveness. He read Clark's mathematical framework, examined her test results, and asked pointed questions about implementation requirements and expected success rates. Then he approved it. Not tentatively, not provisionally, but with full authorization to implement immediately. His written order was characteristically blunt. "This method will be implemented in Hut 8 effective immediately. Miss Clark will oversee implementation and training. Any officer who objects to learning cryptanalytic methods from a competent mathematician, regardless of that mathematician's gender, may submit their objection in writing along with their resignation." Implementation began in April 1940. Clark trained 30 clerks in the statistical methods needed to maintain indicator tables and perform frequency analysis. She created detailed procedures for processing intercepted messages, calculating indicator patterns, and narrowing rotor settings. She designed quality control mechanisms to catch errors. She established shift schedules to ensure 24-hour coverage. Within 3 weeks, the system was operational. The results exceeded even Clark's optimistic projections. The indicator analysis method successfully narrowed daily Enigma settings to testable ranges in 70% of cases. When combined with other cryptanalytic techniques and the increasing availability of bombs, electromechanical machines designed to test multiple rotor settings simultaneously, HUT-8 achieved breakthrough after breakthrough in reading German naval Enigma. By June 1940, Bletchley Park was reading approximately 30% of intercepted German naval messages within 24 hours of interception. By September, that rate had increased to 50%. The intelligence gained from these decrypts provided the Admiralty with invaluable information about U-boat positions, planned attacks, and operational patterns. Convoy routes could be adjusted to avoid U-boat wolf packs. Anti-submarine forces could be directed to areas where U-boats were operating. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had been going disastrously for Britain, began to shift. But Clark's contribution remained classified. When papers were published about Bletchley Park's cryptanalytic successes, her name was absent. When promotions were awarded, male colleagues received recognition while Clark's role was minimized. When historians later wrote about Enigma decryption, they focused on Alan Turing's theoretical contributions and the engineering achievements of the bomb machines. Clark's statistical methods, which had made practical Enigma decryption operationally viable months before the bombs reached full effectiveness, were relegated to footnotes or omitted entirely. The pattern continued throughout the war. Clark would develop a method, prove it worked, train others to implement it. Then credit would flow to male colleagues who had helped implement or manage the system. This wasn't always intentional malice. It was simply how institutional credit operated in 1940s Britain. Men were assumed to be the primary contributors to technical work. Women were assumed to be assistants or supporters, even when they were the actual architects of the methods being used. Clark understood this reality and mostly accepted it with pragmatic resignation. She wasn't working for recognition. She was working to defeat Nazi Germany. Every decrypted message potentially saved lives. Every improvement to cryptanalytic methods shortened the war. That was what mattered. The credit could sort itself out later, if at all. But there were moments when the injustice stung. In September 1941, Clark attended a briefing where senior naval officers discussed improvements in anti-submarine warfare effectiveness. They attributed the improvements to better radar, improved tactics, and advances in signals intelligence capabilities. One officer specifically praised the brilliant young men at Bletchley Park who have given us such advantages in the intelligence war. Clark sat in the back of the room, listening to her work being credited to unnamed men, and felt the particular anger that comes from being simultaneously essential and invisible. After the briefing, she returned to HUT-8 and found Alan Turing working at his usual desk, surrounded by papers covered in mathematical notation. Turing was the closest thing Clark had to an intellectual peer at Bletchley Park, someone who understood mathematics at the level she did and treated her as an equal contributor rather than an unusual curiosity. They had worked together on several problems, with Turing often seeking Clark's input on statistical approaches to cryptanalysis. Clark sat down across from him and spoke with unusual directness. "Alan, do you ever wonder if our work will be properly credited after the war? Or will history remember only the men who happened to be in leadership positions, while the actual work was done by people whose names will be forgotten?" Turing looked up from his calculations, his expression thoughtful. He took a long time to answer, as he always did when considering complex questions. "Joan, I think history generally credits whoever has the best story, not whoever did the best work. The story of brilliant mathematicians defeating Nazi codes is compelling. The story of how those mathematicians were often women whose contributions were systematically minimized is less compelling because it makes the heroes look less heroic. History prefers clean narratives. Reality is messier. Clark nodded. So we're doomed to be forgotten footnotes in someone else's triumph. Turing shook his head. I don't think so. I think documentation survives. Years from now, when all of this is declassified, someone will read the actual operational reports. They'll see your name on the methods that mattered. They'll understand what actually happened. It won't be the popular narrative, but it will be the accurate one, and accuracy eventually matters more than popularity. Turing's prediction proved partially correct. When Bletchley Park documents were declassified in the 1970s, historians discovered the operational reports showing Clark's contributions. Her statistical methods for Enigma indicator analysis were documented in technical reports that clearly attributed the work to her. Her role in training personnel and implementing procedures was described in administrative records. The evidence existed for anyone willing to look. But popular history largely ignored it. Books about Bletchley Park focused on Turing's genius and the dramatic engineering of the bomb machines. Films portrayed code-breaking as the work of eccentric male geniuses, working alone or in small groups. The complex reality that cryptanalysis was collaborative work involving dozens of contributors using different approaches, many of whom were women whose contributions were systematically undervalued, was less cinematically appealing than the lone genius narrative. Clark remained at Bletchley Park throughout the war. She continued developing cryptanalytic methods, training personnel, and solving problems that contributed to Allied victory. In 1944, she was promoted to cryptanalyst, later termed linguist, the highest position a woman could achieve at Bletchley Park. She earned approximately 2/3 the salary of male cryptanalysts doing equivalent work. This pay disparity was official policy, not individual discrimination. Women were systematically paid less than men for identical work throughout the British government. After the war ended in 1945, Clark faced a choice common to many women who had contributed to the war effort. Return to traditional women's work, or try to continue in fields that had been temporarily opened to women by wartime necessity, but were now closing again as men returned from military service. Clark chose to continue as a cryptanalyst, working for the Government Communications Headquarters, the peacetime successor to Bletchley Park's Signals Intelligence Operations. She remained in that position until her retirement in 1977, working on problems that remained classified for decades after she worked on them. She married twice, first briefly to a fellow Bletchley Park colleague, then for 40 years to a military officer. She had no children. She lived quietly, rarely discussing her wartime work even after it was declassified. When journalists occasionally contacted her for interviews about Bletchley Park, she was gracious but deflecting, typically redirecting attention to Turing or other colleagues she considered more important to the overall effort. In 1986, Clark gave a rare extended interview to a historian researching women's contributions to British signals intelligence. The interview covered her entire career, but the historian was particularly interested in the early months of Enigma cryptanalysis, when Clark's methods first proved effective. The historian asked the question that historians always ask: how did it feel to have your work dismissed or credited to others? Clark's answer revealed both the frustration she had felt and the pragmatic acceptance she had cultivated over decades. It felt unjust. It still feels unjust. But I understood that I was operating within a system where women's technical contributions were not expected or valued. The system wasn't designed to recognize me. Fighting the system would have consumed energy better spent on the actual work. So I made a calculated decision. Do the work. Document it properly. Let institutional credit flow wherever it flows. Trust that eventually Someone would care enough to look at the documentation and understand what actually happened. The historian pressed. But don't you wish you had fought harder for recognition? Don't you wish you had demanded credit when it was being distributed? Clark smiled, the expression mixing humor and something darker. Fighting for credit would have required me to stop doing work that saved lives. Every hour I spent arguing about recognition was an hour I wasn't spending on cryptanalysis. I made the choice I could live with. Others might have made different choices. But I don't regret mine. The historian asked one final question. What would you say to the officers who dismissed your work initially, who claimed mathematics was men's work, who said you should be working as a secretary instead of as a cryptanalyst? Clark's answer became the most quoted passage from the interview. Her voice remained level, but the words carried steel underneath the surface politeness. I would say this. While you were dismissing me as a girl who should be taking notes, I was developing methods that helped win the naval intelligence war. While you were questioning whether women could understand naval cryptography, my statistical analysis was narrowing enigma settings and enabling message decryption. While you were protecting your traditional assumptions about who could contribute to mathematics, I was doing the actual mathematics. You laughed, you dismissed, you marginalized, and while you were doing all of that, I was helping to save the merchant ships you claimed to be protecting. So what I would say to those officers is simple. You were wrong. Not just morally wrong, though you were that. Practically wrong. Operationally wrong. You let your biases interfere with your ability to recognize competence. And that incompetence cost time we didn't have and lives we couldn't spare. I hope you learned. I suspect you didn't. The interviewer noted that Clark's tone remained polite throughout this statement, but her words contained anger that had been held back for 40 years. The anger of someone who had been essential but invisible, who had contributed but been erased, who had solved problems while being told she wasn't capable of understanding them. Joan Clark died in 1996 at age 79. Her obituary in the Times was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned her work at Bletchley Park, her long career in cryptanalysis, and her quiet life after retirement. It did not mention the specific contributions she had made to enigma decryption. It did not mention the battles she had fought to have her work taken seriously. It did not mention that her statistical methods had been crucial to Allied success in the Battle of the Atlantic. But in 2019, historians at the Government Communications Headquarters published a comprehensive history of British cryptanalysis during World War II. The history was based on declassified operational documents, technical reports, and personnel records. It included a chapter specifically on statistical methods in enigma cryptanalysis. The chapter clearly documented Clark's contributions, her methodological innovations, and the operational impact of her work. The documentation showed that her indicator analysis method had been operational months before the bomb machines reached full effectiveness and had remained a critical component of enigma decryption throughout the war. The historians concluded their chapter with a pointed observation. Clark's contributions were essential to Allied cryptanalytic success, yet her name rarely appears in popular histories of Bletchley Park. This omission reflects the systematic undervaluation of women's technical contributions during World War II, a pattern that extended far beyond cryptanalysis. The operational records make clear that Clark was not a peripheral figure or helpful assistant. She was a central contributor who developed methods that directly enabled the intelligence victories often attributed to others. That academic recognition came too late for Clark herself. But it created a foundation for understanding what actually happened at Bletchley Park beyond the simplified narratives of lone genius and dramatic machinery. The real story was more complex and more interesting. It was a story of collaboration between mathematicians with different specializations. A story of practical implementation converting theoretical insights into operational capability. A story of institutional biases that made valuable contributions harder to achieve and impossible to properly recognize. And within that larger story, Clarke's narrative illustrated the specific challenges faced by women trying to contribute to technical fields in societies that didn't believe women could or should do such work. Modern cryptanalysts studying the history of their field now recognize Clarke as a pivotal figure in practical signals intelligence. Her methods for statistical analysis of cipher indicators influenced approaches to cryptanalysis that extended far beyond Enigma. Her emphasis on human factors in cipher security, the recognition that human operators would introduce biases regardless of how mathematically secure the underlying cipher was, became a fundamental principle in modern cryptography. Her work demonstrated that breaking codes required not just mathematical brilliance, but also careful attention to how humans actually used cryptographic systems in operational conditions. These contributions are now taught at the Government Communications Headquarters training programs, at the National Security Agency's cryptanalysis courses, and at universities where students study the history and practice of signals intelligence. Clarke's name appears alongside Turing's as a key figure in the development of modern cryptanalysis, not as a footnote, not as an assistant, as a primary contributor whose work was essential to both wartime success and post-war development of the field. But this recognition exists primarily within professional communities. Popular understanding of Bletchley Park still focuses overwhelmingly on male contributors. Films and television shows still marginalize or omit Clarke's role. General audiences still associate Enigma decryption primarily with Turing and with the dramatic imagery of mechanical bombs testing rotor combinations. The statistical methods that made those machines effective remain less visible because statistics is less cinematically appealing than engineering. This creates a curious situation. Within cryptanalysis as a professional field, Clarke is properly recognized. Within popular culture, she remains largely invisible. The accurate narrative exists but doesn't propagate beyond specialist audiences. History has become bifurcated. The academic history that captures complexity and proper attribution, and the popular history that simplifies toward compelling narrative even when that simplification erases essential contributors. Clarke herself would probably be unsurprised by this outcome. She spent her career working in fields where secrecy prevented recognition, where institutional biases minimized her contributions, and where the gap between what actually happened and what was officially recorded was simply part of how the world operated. She adjusted her expectations accordingly. She found satisfaction in the work itself, rather than in external recognition. She documented carefully, knowing that documentation might matter eventually, even if it didn't matter immediately. And she was right. The documentation did matter. It enabled later historians to reconstruct what actually happened. It preserved the technical details that allowed her methods to be properly evaluated and appreciated. It created a record that survived beyond the institutional politics and social biases of 1940s Britain. Not perfect preservation, not immediate recognition, but eventual accuracy, which is perhaps the best outcome that any contributor to classified work can hope for. What Joan Clarke said in 1986 captured the essence of her experience. They laughed, they dismissed, they marginalized, and while they were doing all of that, I was helping to save the ships they claimed to be protecting. That statement applies not just to Clarke, but to countless women who contributed to technical fields during World War II and afterward, who did essential work while being told they weren't capable of doing it, who succeeded despite institutional barriers rather than because of institutional support. Their stories are harder to tell than the stories of celebrated geniuses working alone. They require acknowledging that success came from collaboration, that brilliance existed in unexpected places, that institutional biases made victory harder to achieve and properly credit. These are uncomfortable truths that complicate heroic narratives, but they are accurate truths that better reflect how complex technical achievements actually happen. Clark's legacy isn't just the specific methods she developed for Enigma cryptanalysis. Her legacy is the demonstration that mathematical ability transcends social categories, that prejudice is operationally costly, that institutions that exclude capable people for arbitrary reasons pay prices in effectiveness and success. These lessons were visible in 1940 to anyone willing to see them. Most people weren't willing. Some people eventually became willing. And that slow, incomplete progress toward recognizing competence, regardless of demographic characteristics, is perhaps the larger story that Clark's specific cryptanalytic achievements illuminate. In the end, what matters is not whether popular history remembers every contributor. What matters is whether the work got done, whether lives were saved, whether victory was achieved. Clark contributed to all of those outcomes. She did work that mattered under conditions that undervalued her, and she documented that work carefully enough that eventually someone would understand what happened. That's not the triumphant ending that Hollywood prefers, but it's the accurate ending. And accuracy, as Joan Clark understood, eventually matters more than popularity.